He was sent to erase her cafe and ended up fighting for it. Ellie moved behind the counter with practiced ease, her hands sliding over polished wood, polishing smudges that the morning light highlighted like tiny flaws in a painting. The cafe smelled of roasted coffee beans, warm pastries, and faint traces of the rain-soaked streets outside. The grind was more than a coffee shop. It was the stubborn heart of a neighborhood slowly eroding under city plans and gentrification. Every chipped tile, every squeak of the front door, every familiar face that passed through carried stories she felt responsible to protect. She glanced out the window at the streets beginning to stir. Delivery trucks rattled over uneven pavement. A cyclist nearly collided with a pedestrian. And from down the block, the hum of construction equipment reminded her that her corner of the world was fragile. A tension in her chest tightened. One wrong project, one inattentive decision, and this place could vanish. The bell over the door chimed sharply. Ellie instinctively straightened her posture, ready to greet, or defend, her space. In stepped a man, tall and sharply dressed, a faint scent of expensive cologne trailing him. His shoes clicked against the floor with quiet authority. He paused near the doorway, scanning the cafe with a mixture of curiosity and calculation, eyes briefly flicking over the handwritten menus, the small potted plants lining the shelves, the paintings of local artists hanging slightly askew on the walls. He approached the counter with measured steps, his gaze settling on Ellie. "Morning," he said, his voice calm and precise. "Espresso. Double shot. Quick, if possible." Ellie's fingers froze mid-wipe. She studied him for a moment. His suit was impeccable, his watch expensive, the pen clipped to his notebook practically gleaming. "We aim to please," she said, sliding a cup under the machine's spout. "But rushing coffee is a risky business. You might not survive it." He chuckled, a brief smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll take that risk." Ellie didn't offer another word, focusing instead on the espresso machine. She measured the beans with a ritualistic precision, feeling the comforting weight of familiarity in every motion. Her hands were steady, practiced, though a subtle tension lingered, as if the cafe itself sensed the intrusion. He leaned against the counter, relaxed but attentive, watching her work. "I like your style," he said. "Direct. Efficient." Ellie arched an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth twitching in amusement. "And I like when customers respect the rhythm here. Coffee's not just fuel. It's community. Conversation." A pause from the chaos outside. He raised one eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Chaos, or potential. Sometimes a city needs structure, planning, maybe even a little concrete to make sense of it all. Ellie stopped mid-motion, setting the freshly poured espresso aside. The words were a spark, igniting a flare of irritation. Concrete doesn't build community. It replaces it. And some of us are still fighting for a neighborhood with soul. He leaned back slightly, intrigued, not defensive, his tone softer now. "Soul? That's a quaint argument. But sentiment has its place, even in urban planning." His gaze lingered on her, and for a moment, she felt exposed, as if he saw the weight of every effort she had made to keep this street alive. Ellie bristled, but tried to maintain composure. "I'm not talking about quaint. I'm talking about lives. Memories. Faces that pass through here every day. My cafe is a home for them, and I won't let anyone, especially someone wielding a ruler and blueprint, erase it." He smirked, not mockingly, but with curiosity. "Blueprints don't erase memories, but they can shape the future. I wonder if you'd see the value in that." Before she could respond, a sudden jolt, a careless gesture from him, and his briefcase tipped against the counter. Coffee splashed across the floor. Ellie's eyes widened. "Watch it," she snapped, grabbing a stack of napkins. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, bending to help. His voice held genuine concern, his cheeks tinged with embarrassment. "I didn't mean." Ellie sighed, kneeling to mop the spill. "This isn't just a floor. It's the heart of the block." Her voice softened, though the edge remained. "Be careful where you put your hands." He straightened, eyes meeting hers. "You really mean it," he said quietly. "This place matters." Ellie met his gaze, surprised at the sincerity in his tone. "Of course it matters. Every laugh, every complaint, every late-night writer or tired student. This is my corner of the world, and I'm not letting anyone erase it without a fight." He nodded, a flicker of respect crossing his expression. "Then I guess we'll see whose vision prevails, won't we?" Ellie finished cleaning the floor, returning to her counter with deliberate calm. She placed a clean espresso cup in front of him, eyes steady. "We will," she said. For a long, suspended moment, they regarded each other, the cafe's ambient noise fading to a soft hum around them. The silence between them felt heavy, weighted with an ideological friction that neither was ready to yield to. It wasn't just attraction, it was a collision of two unmoving forces, one built on memory, the other on cold, calculated geometry. Outside, the streets were waking, unaware that the fate of a small, defiant café had just intersected with the intentions of an architect. Inside, the first tremors of connection and conflict had begun. Ellie returned to her counter, mechanically polishing cups while sneaking glances at him. Mark, notebook in hand, observed her actions with quiet fascination, mentally cataloging not only the space but the woman defending it. Neither spoke again for several minutes, but the air vibrated with unspoken challenges, mutual assessment, and the undeniable awareness that neither encounter would be easily forgotten. By the time Mark left, leaving a tip on the counter, Ellie felt a strange mixture of irritation and intrigue. She muttered under her breath, "That one's trouble, or he might just be trouble worth knowing." Mark walked into the morning sunlight, coffee in hand, the city buzzing around him. But in his mind, the images of chipped tiles, laughter, and a fiercely determined barista lingered longer than he expected. He realized, with a mix of amusement and frustration, that he hadn't simply walked into a cafe, he had stepped into someone's world. And that world was about to challenge his. The next morning, the streets outside the grind carried a tentative quiet, the soft light catching the damp edges of pavement and faded brick. Ellie had barely opened the cafe when the bell rang again. She looked up, expecting a familiar regular, and froze. "Mark." Again. He smiled faintly, as if noticing her tension but choosing to ignore it. "Good morning," he said. "Same as yesterday, I think." Ellie's lips pressed into a thin line. "Double espresso. And don't let the concrete talk get in the way of coffee etiquette." He chuckled, accepting the gentle jab. "I'll try. No promises." Over the next hour, Mark settled into a corner with his laptop and sketches, occasionally glancing up to observe Ellie as she moved with graceful efficiency between orders. She noticed his attention and felt a prick of irritation. Is he judging me? Or just studying the place for destruction? "Do you always come here at the crack of dawn?" Ellie asked, breaking the silence. "I need the quiet to think," he replied without looking up. "The streets are too chaotic for precise calculations." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Chaos is part of life. You try to calculate it, and you erase the soul of the city." He paused, finally meeting her gaze. "Soul doesn't pay rent, Ellie. Functionality does. That's the tension we live with." Her name on his lips made her stomach twist unexpectedly. It's not just about functionality. It's about connection. The relationships people have with their environment, with each other, that's what lasts. Mark leaned back, fingers steepled over his laptop. "I see your point, but sometimes a street needs a framework. Otherwise, it collapses under its own history." Ellie scoffed lightly, moving to rest her hands on the counter. "Collapses? Or you just want an excuse to replace the familiar with something sterile and new?" He smirked, acknowledging the edge in her voice. "Perhaps. Or maybe I see potential where you see tradition. But maybe we're both right in our own ways." Their exchanges became routine. Each morning, Mark would appear, a silent observer at first, gradually contributing small comments or questions about the neighborhood, the cafe, the people. Ellie, defensive at first, began to see his observations were not entirely condescending. They were careful, analytical, and sometimes insightful. She started to notice nuances, the way he would greet elderly patrons politely, quietly hold the door open for passing neighbors, and ask questions not just about architecture, but about the community. Something in his manner suggested he was more than the cold professional she assumed him to be. One rainy afternoon, Ellie spotted him carrying an umbrella, struggling slightly with the wind. She stepped outside. "Here," she said, handing him a second umbrella she kept for emergencies. "The city isn't always kind." Mark hesitated, then accepted it with a nod. "Thank you. That was considerate." She shrugged, brushing damp hair from her eyes. "You spend enough time here, you learn to survive. And maybe learn a little kindness along the way." He glanced at her, and in that fleeting moment, There was a crack in the professional armor he usually wore. Kindness, he repeated softly. I might try that. Days turned into weeks. Their conversations remained cautious, yet layered with unspoken acknowledgement of each other's values. Mark began asking more about the cafe, the events Ellie hosted for neighbors, and the small victories she celebrated quietly. Ellie, in turn, learned details about his projects, how he approached urban planning not purely as destruction, but sometimes as an attempt to reconcile old and new. Still, the tension never fully dissipated. A late-morning argument over the placement of a small mural, a piece of local art, became a debate about aesthetics versus functionality. Ellie defended the mural with fierce passion, Mark countered with architectural reasoning. Their voices rose and fell like waves, neither truly conceding, but both secretly enjoying the intellectual sparring. And yet, beneath the edge of irritation, a subtle current began to flow, a recognition that despite clashing philosophies, they were both fiercely committed to preserving what they valued most. For Ellie, it was the community, the people. For Mark, it was the potential for a balanced future. And in that tension, there was a spark, an unacknowledged attraction, threaded through every debate, every glance, every measured word. The cafe became their battleground and their meeting ground. Each day, they tested each other, challenged each other, and gradually, without admitting it aloud, began to understand one another. Ellie saw that Mark's work could include empathy, not just concrete and steel. Mark realized that soul mattered as much as structure, that a street could be both functional and alive. By the time he left on that Thursday evening, the bell chiming behind him, Ellie felt an unfamiliar warmth, a mix of frustration and anticipation. She knew she would see him again tomorrow, and she knew, without saying it aloud, that the neighborhood, and perhaps her heart, was beginning to depend on him in ways she had not anticipated. Outside, the streets carried the sounds of the city in motion, delivery trucks, distant laughter, the scrape of shoes on wet pavement. Inside, the cafe's lights glowed warmly, a small island of connection in a world that seemed intent on rushing past. Ellie looked out the window after Mark departed, a small, knowing smile forming. This is going to be interesting, she thought. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the grind, casting golden stripes across the worn wooden floor. Ellie stacked cups behind the counter, absently wiping fingerprints and coffee stains, when she noticed Mark sitting quietly at his usual table, sketching in a notebook. Normally, she would approach him with a playful jab or a remark about coffee etiquette. Today, she felt something sharper, more urgent. Her heartbeat quickened at the thought of what she had just discovered. She took a deep breath and walked over, letting her heels click decisively against the floor. "Mark," she said, keeping her voice steady. "We need to talk." He looked up, sensing the sudden seriousness in her tone. "Everything okay?" His pencil hovered mid-sketch, the sunlight catching the edge of his notebook. Ellie placed her hands firmly on the counter, leaning slightly forward. "I know who you are. You're the architect behind the redevelopment plan, the one that targets this cafe." Her voice didn't waver, though her chest tightened. "You've been coming here, sipping coffee, learning about our neighborhood, and planning to erase it." For a brief moment, Mark's face went pale, his usually measured composure faltering. "Ellie," she cut him off, eyes flashing. "Save it. I'm not asking for excuses. I'm asking for choices. Right now, you have a decision to make. You can leave, pretend this conversation never happened, and continue your project, or you can see what it's like to keep this place alive." He blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "See what it's like?" "Yes," she said, her tone softening fractionally, though the steel in her words remained. "I'm giving you 1 day. 1 day working in the cafe. No shortcuts. You grind beans, serve customers, clean tables, hear their stories, feel the rhythm of this place. Only then, maybe, you'll understand what you're really planning to destroy." Mark leaned back in his chair, surprised. The intensity in her eyes made it clear this was no idle suggestion. He opened his mouth to protest, to insist he was far too busy, that a single day could not possibly be meaningful. But something in her stance, in the weight of her words, made him pause. He had walked into this neighborhood with measured steps, calculations, and spreadsheets, convinced that logic and planning would carry the day. Yet now, faced with the pulse of a small cafe, and its fiercely protective owner, he felt the first stirrings of doubt. "Fine," he said finally, his voice low. One day, Ellie's eyes narrowed, suspicion and something like relief mingling. "Not because you want to. Because I asked." He nodded. "Because you asked." The following morning, he arrived before dawn, dressed in a plain shirt and jeans, an intentional shedding of his usual professional armor. Ellie handed him an apron, its fabric slightly stiff from washing. "Wear it," she said curtly, "and try not to ruin it." He hesitated, fumbling as he tied the strings. "Right. Not ruining it." Ellie smirked briefly, the tension breaking slightly. "We'll see." The day was brutal in a way spreadsheets and blueprints never were. Mark measured each movement, each order, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled espresso shots, wiped counters, and balanced trays laden with steaming mugs. The cafe hummed with life. A retired schoolteacher ordering her usual cappuccino, a young couple arguing softly over seating, a writer typing furiously in a corner. Mark observed, noting more than he had anticipated, the smiles, the complaints, the subtle rhythms that made the cafe more than a business. Ellie moved alongside him, correcting his technique, explaining the quirks of each machine, teaching him to notice the small things, the temperature of the water, the subtle grind differences, the way a regular smile could make or break a morning. At first, Mark resisted, mechanically replicating instructions. But gradually, he began to see the method in the chaos, the pulse of the cafe, the unseen heart of the neighborhood that spreadsheets could never capture. During a lull, they carried crates of pastries from the delivery truck. Ellie wiped sweat from her brow, glancing at Mark as he strained with the weight of a box. "Not as easy as designing buildings, huh?" she teased lightly. Mark laughed, the sound a little hollow but genuine. "Buildings don't spill coffee on old floors." Ellie paused, studying him. There was an unfamiliar vulnerability in his eyes, a softness beneath the usual professional detachment. "You're starting to get it," she said quietly. He looked at her, a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. "I think I am. I didn't realize this mattered so much to you." Ellie's chest tightened at his words. It was the first time he had acknowledged her world without judgment, without debate. "It's not just me," she said softly. "It's everyone who calls this street home. And this cafe, it's their anchor. If it goes, something else dies too." Mark nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I see that now." The afternoon blurred into evening. By the time the last customer left, Ellie and Mark were hauling chairs, cleaning floors, and restocking shelves. Their hands occasionally brushed. Their movements began to synchronize without words. Fatigue and shared effort had a strange way of dissolving walls. When the cafe finally fell silent, Ellie collapsed onto a chair behind the counter, wiping her forehead. Mark leaned against the doorframe, exhausted, yet there was a light in his eyes Ellie hadn't seen before. "You stayed," she said simply, nodding toward him. "I stayed," he replied, voice quiet. "Because I wanted to understand. And because you made it impossible to leave indifferent." A flicker of warmth passed through Ellie. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, saw beyond the architect, beyond the blueprints, beyond the future that threatened her cafe. She saw a man capable of empathy, capable of choosing differently, if he dared. For the first time, the tension between them softened, not fully, not yet, but a fragile truce had formed. Sparks still lingered, but now there was understanding, vulnerability, and a tentative respect, all forged in a single, grueling day that neither would forget. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that in a small cafe on a fading street, two very different worlds had collided, and perhaps begun to merge. The sun was dipping low over the city, casting long shadows through the streets that cradled the grind. Ellie leaned against the counter, savoring a rare, quiet moment after a bustling afternoon. The cafe smelled faintly of espresso and fresh pastry, a comforting scent that had become her armor against the encroaching city. The bell above the door chimed, but this time, it didn't announce a regular customer or even Mark. It was a different presence altogether, tall, impeccably dressed, and radiating authority with an undercurrent of cold calculation. Julie. Ellie straightened instantly. She had heard about Julie before, of course, the vice president of the development company, the woman responsible for accelerating projects that sometimes crushed neighborhoods in their wake. But seeing her in person was a different weight entirely. Julie's gaze swept over the cafe, sharp and assessing, lingering for a heartbeat too long on the worn tables, the counter, and finally on Ellie. Ellie, Julie said, her tone measured, smooth, but icy. I hope I'm not interrupting anything too cozy. Ellie met her gaze without flinching. I can't imagine what brings you here, but this is a place of work, not sightseeing. Julie smiled faintly, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, I'm very aware. I'm here on business. She let her eyes flick toward the corner where Mark had been quietly finishing his notes earlier in the day. He was nowhere to be seen now, but the tension in the room thickened immediately. Ellie's fingers tightened around the counter edge. Business that involves threatening my cafe? She asked, her voice low but unwavering. Julie's smile didn't waver. You call it threatening. I call it development. Progress. Opportunity. She moved gracefully toward the center of the room, the click of her heels on the tile floor punctuating her words. You see, progress has rules. And those rules are not written for sentiment. They're written for efficiency, for growth, for control. Ellie's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. Control, she repeated. By erasing lives, histories, and communities. That's your idea of efficiency. Julie tilted her head, regarding her as if she were an interesting specimen. Efficiency sometimes requires difficult choices. Choices that some people are too sentimental to make themselves. Her gaze flicked toward the door again, as though expecting someone, or perhaps marking territory. I've noticed someone has been spending an unusual amount of time in this neighborhood. Mark, was it? I wonder what he's been learning from you, Ellie. Ellie stiffened, the pieces clicking into place. Mark's growing interest in the cafe, his sudden appearances, Julie had noticed. And now, here she was, a predator in a tailored suit, testing boundaries, asserting dominance. Julie's eyes sharpened. I admire the sentiment, Ellie, truly. Nostalgia is a charming luxury. But your cafe is just a crack in the foundation of a city trying to grow. I'm offering this neighborhood billions in investment, safety, and a future. You're offering them coffee in a building with wiring that dates back to the Great Depression. You aren't saving this block. You're just holding on to a past that you can't afford to maintain. Ellie took a step forward, her chest rising with controlled fury. I stand here, with my cafe, with my community, and I won't let anyone, destroy it without a fight. Julie's smile returned, a thin, sharp line that could cut glass. Brave words. Charming, even. But words are fragile. Actions are permanent. Remember that, Ellie. The bell above the door chimed again. Mark stepped inside, his usual calm replaced by an almost imperceptible tension. Julie's gaze flicked toward him, then back to Ellie. Ah, she said, her tone like silk wrapping around steel. I see our friend has found your world. Fascinating, hasn't he? Ellie's jaw tightened. Mark makes his own choices. Julie laughed softly, almost mockingly. Does he? Or is he being influenced by sentiment, by you? She leaned slightly, her voice dropping, dangerous in its intimacy. I've always believed in guiding decisions before they become inconvenient. Mark finally spoke, his voice measured but firm. Julie, this isn't a conversation about controlling people. It's about understanding. And I've been learning. Julie's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing her otherwise unreadable face. Learning, Do be careful. Curiosity can be costly. She stepped toward the door, glancing back once. I expect results, Mark. And I expect you to remember your obligations. Personal distractions are liabilities. With that, she left, leaving a silence that felt thick enough to choke on. Ellie exhaled slowly, her hands still gripping the counter. Mark leaned against the doorway, tension evident in his posture. That was intense, he said quietly. Ellie turned to him, her gaze sharp but not unkind. That's Julie. Cold, calculating, dangerous. She'll do everything she can to break this place. And you, if you let her. Mark's jaw tightened. I see that now. Ellie's expression softened slightly. I don't trust her, and I don't trust that she won't use you, or me, or anyone who gets in her way. He nodded, the weight of reality pressing down. I'll be careful, but I also have to figure out what matters, what I truly value. Ellie met his gaze. For the first time, there was a fragile understanding between them, tempered not by comfort, but by the threat of outside forces. They had survived a day of coffee and shared labor. Now they faced a storm that could undo everything if they weren't prepared. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the tensions brewing within the walls of a small cafe. But inside, Ellie and Mark knew the stakes had just escalated, and the line between personal connection and professional obligation had just become painfully blurred. The sky had deepened to a rich indigo as the last customers trickled out of the grind. Ellie wiped down the counter, her movements deliberate, though fatigue had begun to weigh on her. The day had been relentless, espresso machines whirring, trays of pastries shifting under the weight of impatient hands, and the lingering tension from Julie's visit gnawed at her nerves. The door opened again. Mark stepped in, carrying a small toolkit in one hand, a casual smile on his face despite the long day. "Evening," he said softly, as if greeting a fellow survivor. Ellie glanced up, surprise and weariness mingling on her face. "Mark, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be, I don't know, redesigning the city or avoiding corporate assassins?" He chuckled lightly, shrugging. "Actually, I'm hoping to help." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Help with what exactly?" He nodded toward the apartment next door. "Mr. Hawkins. Heard his front gate was acting up again. Thought I could lend a hand." Ellie blinked. Mr. Hawkins, a retired teacher and lifelong resident, had been a frequent presence at the cafe, often sharing stories, wisdom, and complaints in equal measure. Ellie had promised herself she would never allow anyone to take advantage of him, even as the city shifted around them. "Fine," she said, setting down the cloth. "If you break anything, you're paying for it." Mark followed her outside. The evening air was cool, carrying faint scents of coffee grounds and wet asphalt. Mr. Hawkins's gate, a small metal structure that had survived decades of weather, hung crooked and stubborn. Ellie handed Mark a wrench. "You have to be careful. It's old, but it's delicate." Mark nodded, crouching down and inspecting the hinges. "Old doesn't mean useless," he said softly. "Just misunderstood." Ellie couldn't help but smile faintly. "I suppose we're both guilty of that sometimes." They worked in companionable silence at first. The squeak of rusted metal, the occasional click of tools, and the soft hum of the city created a rhythm they fell into together. Mark adjusted a hinge, muttering under his breath about torque and leverage, while Ellie held the gate steady, offering quiet advice and occasional jokes to lighten the tension. "Not bad," Ellie said after a particularly tricky adjustment. "You might actually know what you're doing." He wiped sweat from his brow and offered a tired smile. "I've built a few things in my life, but never quite like this." Ellie glanced at him. "This?" He nodded toward the gate, then back at the cafe visible in the near distance. "This. The community. The effort it takes to protect something that matters. Not because it's profitable, but because it's alive." Her chest tightened. No architect had ever spoken like that to her before. "You really are starting to understand," she said quietly, almost to herself. For the first time, the space between them felt smaller. Mark leaned against the gate for a moment, and Ellie realized how much she had come to rely on his quiet presence, even if she refused to admit it fully. As they stepped back to admire their work, the gate now secure, a comfortable silence settled over them. The fading sunlight caught Mark's profile, highlighting the seriousness in his expression. "Ellie, I didn't expect today to feel meaningful like this. Not just work. Connection. People." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. "Meaning comes from effort, Mark. And from caring, not from blueprints and deadlines." He turned to face her, the tension in his jaw softening. "I see that now. And I'm glad I stayed." Their eyes met, and for a long moment, the world outside, the impending redevelopment, Julie's threats, the city's indifferent pulse, faded. They were two people, standing together, having shared a day of honest labor and subtle revelations. Ellie reached for the wrench at the same time as him, but she pulled her hand back a split second before they touched. The air between them felt tight, charged with a tension she wasn't ready to name, but she kept her distance, focusing on the rusted metal instead. Instead, it lingered, a silent acknowledgement of something fragile and unspoken. "I've never told anyone this," Mark admitted softly, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze. "But I'm afraid sometimes. Of losing control, of making decisions that destroy more than they create." Ellie's eyes softened. "You're human," she said simply. "And that's okay. I'm afraid too. Of losing the cafe, of losing the people I care about. even losing myself. Mark swallowed, nodding slowly. I understand that better than I thought I could. The first real trust had been forged, not through arguments or plans, but through shared effort, vulnerability, and mutual acknowledgement of fear and hope. They had stepped outside their professional facades, and for the first time, the tension between them included possibility, not just conflict. As they walked back to the cafe together, their steps almost in sync, Ellie realized something startling. The architect who had once seemed intent on destruction was beginning to see the world as she did, not in blueprints and deadlines, but in lives, stories, and moments like this. Mark glanced at her quietly. "Thank you for letting me see this side of your world." Ellie smiled faintly, her chest still fluttering from the closeness and shared effort. "Just don't forget it," she said. "Some things are worth more than any project or profit." Outside, the streetlights flickered on, bathing the neighborhood in gentle amber light. Inside, the grind waited, a sanctuary and a battlefield both, carrying within it the fragile beginnings of trust, attraction, and shared purpose. The city hummed with indifferent energy as Mark left the grind that evening, the glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet asphalt. His mind wasn't on the glowing windows of the cafe or the faint aroma of roasted beans lingering in his clothes. It was on Julie. Julie had summoned him to her office in the high-rise building overlooking the district. The elevator ride had been silent, save for the soft hum of cables and the occasional beep marking each floor. Mark's stomach churned. He had known the meeting would be tense, but he had not anticipated the cold precision with which Julie would wield her control. Her office was pristine, immaculate in a way that made the city below feel chaotic and insignificant. Julie was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands clasped lightly behind her back, watching the skyline with a faint smile. She turned, and her gaze sliced through him. "Mark," she said smoothly, "I hear you've been spending an unusual amount of time socializing in the neighborhood with people who have a vested interest in delaying progress." He swallowed, trying to steady his voice. "I'm observing the community, understanding the impact of the project. Isn't that responsible?" Julie's lips curved into a thin, measured smile. "Responsible, perhaps. Admirable, even. But it conflicts with your obligations." She stepped closer, letting her presence dominate the space. "You're contractually bound, Mark. Every hour spent here, every personal attachment you form, creates risk. You know that, don't you?" Mark met her gaze, clenched fists at his sides. "I know my responsibilities, but I also know that people's lives matter, that there's more at stake than contracts and deadlines." Julie's eyes narrowed, sharp and unyielding. "Let me be clear." Her voice dropped slightly, icy and precise. "The cafe must be demolished. On schedule. No delays. Your attachment to it, to her, Ellie, is unacceptable. You have a choice. Either you fulfill your professional duties, which includes authorizing the demolition, or I will take legal action against you personally. And you know what's at stake. Your custody rights, your career, your reputation." Mark felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. Every syllable was a calculated threat, a scalpel aimed precisely at his vulnerabilities. He clenched his jaw. "And if I don't comply?" Julie's smile widened just enough to be cruel. "Then you lose. Everything you care about becomes collateral damage. And I will ensure the world knows you were negligent, selfish, incapable of fulfilling your responsibilities." Mark nodded slowly, swallowing his panic. He understood clearly. Julie was not bluffing. She would use every lever at her disposal, legal, social, corporate, to force him into compliance. When he left her office, the streets felt narrower, darker, almost hostile. How can I protect Ellie, protect the cafe, without betraying my obligations? The question gnawed at him relentlessly. Back at his small apartment, Mark spread out the blueprints across the dining table. The pencil trembled in his hand, but he steadied it. He began to redraw sections of the redevelopment plan, subtly adjusting layouts, rerouting pathways, integrating the grind into the new design as a preserved landmark rather than a casualty. Each line he drew carried immense risk. Discovery could cost him everything Julie had threatened. He worked late into the night, the city outside his window a blur of lights and motion. Each adjustment was a gamble, a silent rebellion against Julie's rigid plans. He knew he could not reveal any of this to Ellie. She could never understand the duplicity required to protect her. Not yet. By the time he finally set down his pencil, exhaustion had left his body aching, but a fragile determination burned within him. He had chosen a path, dangerous, secretive, and morally precarious, but it was one that preserved hope. Hope for the cafe, for the community, and for Ellie. As dawn crept across the city, Mark leaned back in his chair, staring at the plans. He was playing a game of shadows, balancing on a knife's edge. One misstep, one exposure, and everything would crumble. His career, his personal life, his relationship with Ellie. But he could not abandon her. He would not. And somewhere deep in the corner of his mind, he admitted a truth he had been avoiding. The risk was worth it. Because by fighting Julie's control and secret, he was also fighting for the fragile bond forming with Ellie, the one spark in his life that made all the danger meaningful. Outside, the first buses rumbled through the streets, the hum of a waking city carrying on unaware. Inside, Mark sat alone, pencil poised, heart racing. He was now a double agent in his own life, juggling loyalty, love, and survival, knowing full well that every choice had consequences he might not survive. The morning sunlight streamed into the grind, catching the dust motes in golden beams that made the cafe look peaceful, almost eternal. Ellie moved through the space with practiced efficiency, pulling trays of croissants from the oven, cleaning countertops, and wiping tables. The bell above the door chimed, a sound she had grown used to, expecting a regular customer, or, more recently, Mark. But this morning, the air was heavier. Her intuition prickled as she noticed the unusual envelope left on a corner table, thick and official-looking. The handwriting was unfamiliar. She frowned, lifting it with caution. Inside were documents stamped with the corporate seal, Mark's signature clearly visible. Her heart lurched as her eyes skimmed the first lines. Demolition schedule, authorization, and project approval for the grind. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. She read again, hoping it was some mistake, some misunderstanding. But the words, the signature, the schedule, they were all there. Mark had signed. Her hands shook, and the cafe seemed suddenly too small, too exposed. The memories of shared labor, laughter, and late-night cleaning flashed in her mind. Every fragile connection they had built over weeks, every ounce of trust, shattered in an instant. Mark appeared in the doorway at that moment, holding his usual notebook, looking weary but unaware of the storm brewing inside the cafe. Ellie, he began softly. She slammed the envelope onto the counter between them, voice sharp and raw. Explain this. Now, Mark's eyes widened as he took in the papers. Ellie, listen. That's a site access authorization, not a final demolition order. Julie forced my hand with the custody threat, but signing that was the only way to keep my admin credentials active for one more week. Without that signature, she would have locked me out of the server last night, and I never would have found the proof of her bribes. I had to look like I was complying to stay in the game. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. Ellie, no. She cut him off, stepping back, hands clenched. Don't even try. Don't tell me this was some clever plan to save the cafe or whatever twisted logic you have in your head. You betrayed me. I trusted you. He took a careful step forward, voice low and pleading. Ellie, you don't understand. It's not what it looks like. Julie, Ellie shook her head violently. Julie doesn't matter. You matter. And right now, you're nothing but a liar in my eyes. A liar who was pretending to care while signing away everything I've built. The cafe felt suffocating, the aroma of coffee now acrid with disbelief. Mark's chest tightened. He wanted desperately to explain the clandestine adjustments he had made overnight to preserve the cafe, but the words died on his lips. The look in her eyes, raw, betrayed, searing, made it impossible to speak without further damaging the fragile remnants of their relationship. Ellie's voice softened slightly, a whisper now, but edged with finality. You were part of my world, Mark. And now you're gone from it. He tried to reach for her hand, but she recoiled instinctively, the barrier between them now unbreachable. Ellie, please. I didn't sign it, not really. I'm trying to fix this. She turned abruptly, moving behind the counter as though shielding herself. Don't follow me. I don't want to see you. Not today. Not ever again. The bell above the door chimed once more, indifferent to the human drama unfolding inside. The quiet moments of connection, laughter, and understanding. All of it vanished, replaced by silence heavy with pain and disappointment. Mark sank onto a stool near the door, his notebook abandoned on the floor. The weight of Julie's manipulation, the exposure, and the irrevocable fracture of trust pressed down on him. Every plan, every careful adjustment to the redevelopment plan, now seemed meaningless if Ellie could not see the truth. Ellie moved among the tables, wiping down surfaces with mechanical precision, though her hands trembled. Her mind raced, imagining the consequences, the café's demolition looming closer, the betrayal of her most recent trust, and the fragility of her community. Every thought ended in one painful realization. She could not, and would not, allow herself to be vulnerable again. Not to Mark, not to anyone. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious. The street, the traffic, the passing strangers. None of it would pause for their heartbreak. Inside, the grind felt colder, emptier, a sanctuary betrayed by the person she had started to trust most. Mark sat in silence, staring at the floor, understanding finally that every secret, every decision made in isolation, had consequences far beyond the pages of his blueprints. Trust, once broken, was harder to rebuild than any structural plan he had ever drafted. And for Ellie, the world had shifted. The café she had fought for, the community she had nurtured, and the fragile bond with a man she thought understood her, all felt suddenly precarious, teetering on the edge of loss. The city outside Mark's apartment was alive with indifferent motion, buses rumbling, tires splashing through puddles, office windows glowing like distant stars. But inside, his world had collapsed. He sat on the edge of his sofa, hands gripping the cushions, staring at the floor as if it held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. Ellie's expression haunted him, the betrayal she had perceived, the rage, the hurt. He had never seen anyone look at him that way. Not a client, not a colleague, not even his own daughter. And now she had closed the door between them, physically and emotionally, leaving him alone with the weight of his choices. His phone buzzed. A message from his lawyer. Custody arrangements adjusted, temporary restrictions enacted. You will have no unsupervised access until further review. Mark closed his eyes, exhaling a shaky breath. Julie had played her hand with ruthless precision. She hadn't just manipulated him professionally. She had weaponized the law and his personal life against him. He had lost access to his daughter, the woman he cared for, and, potentially, his career. For a moment, despair threatened to swallow him. The café, Ellie, the fragile trust they had built, all seemed irretrievable. Every careful plan he had made in secret felt pointless. He had gambled and lost. Then his mind sharpened. Anger replaced despair. Julie's arrogance, her overconfidence, her belief that she could control every outcome. Those were exploitable weaknesses. If he could find the evidence, the undeniable proof of her corrupt manipulation during the redevelopment tenders, he could strike back. He moved with renewed purpose, gathering files, corporate reports, emails, and financial statements. Every document Julie had left in digital shadows, every misrepresented contract, every manipulated tender, all could be leveraged. Hours blurred into nights as Mark sifted through digital archives, making duplicates, encrypting them, and storing them in secure locations he knew Julie wouldn't anticipate. But it wasn't enough to simply collect evidence. He needed to act decisively. He needed to reclaim what had been taken from him, the ability to protect the café, the community, and perhaps, in time, Ellie's trust. For the first time since the betrayal, he allowed himself a quiet acknowledgement. He was going all in, risking career, reputation, and legal standing. Nothing could stop him except his own failure, and he refused to fail. The city outside remained indifferent, a reminder of the stakes. Every sound, the distant sirens, the hum of early traffic, the occasional shout from a street vendor, was a countdown, a rhythm urging him forward. By dawn, Mark leaned back in his chair, exhaustion heavy in his limbs, but determination blazing in his chest. He had a plan: present the evidence at the public hearing, expose Julie's corruption, and save the grind, not as an employee, not as a pawn, but as an independent voice. For a moment, he allowed himself a fragile, almost forbidden thought. If he succeeded, he might rebuild some semblance of what he had lost. Perhaps Ellie's trust could be earned again, slowly, Carefully, honestly this time. The sun rose, spilling pale light across the apartment. Mark looked out at the city, a silent vow forming in his mind. Julie had thought she could corner him, manipulate him, force him to comply. She had underestimated one thing: his refusal to surrender completely, his unwillingness to allow her greed and arrogance to destroy everything he cared about. Mark rose from the chair, stretching his stiff muscles. The path ahead was dangerous, filled with uncertainty, but he was ready. For the cafe, for the community, for the woman he loved, and for himself. He picked up his laptop, opened the encrypted folder, and stared at the files one last time. Each byte, each line, each piece of evidence was a weapon, and he would use them, because now there was no turning back. The conference room buzzed with controlled tension. City officials, media representatives, and community members filled every chair, their eyes shifting between the podium and the rows of attendees. Posters advocating for redevelopment clashed visually with handwritten signs defending the grind. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation. Ellie stood near the back, arms crossed, her expression guarded. She had spent the night preparing emotionally for this moment, rehearsing arguments, breathing exercises, reminding herself that her community's future depended on composure. Every fiber of her being screamed with anxiety and hope. Mark stepped up to the podium, carrying a slim briefcase. His movements were calm, measured, deliberate. Every eye turned to him, some skeptical, some curious. Julie was seated prominently at the front, her posture perfect, her gaze sharp as a blade, radiating authority and confidence. She exuded the same cold precision that had haunted Mark for weeks. He opened the briefcase, revealing neatly organized documents, digital tablets, and printed evidence. The room seemed to inhale collectively. Mark's voice, calm but resolute, cut through the hum. "Good morning," he began. "I am here not as a representative of the redevelopment company, but as an independent consultant and member of this community. I am here to present evidence of mismanagement, undue influence, and corruption in the redevelopment project, specifically regarding decisions that threaten the existence of the grind." Murmurs rippled through the room. Julie's eyes narrowed, her expression unchanged, but her fingers tapped lightly against her notebook. She knew Mark had leverage, but she hadn't anticipated the breadth and clarity of his documentation. Mark opened a file on the screen, a leaked internal memo flashing for everyone to see. "This isn't just about zoning," Mark said, his voice echoing. "This is a suppressed structural report. Julie, you personally ordered the engineers to ignore the historic preservation status of the cafe's foundation because it would cost your investors an extra $8 million to build around it. You didn't just plan a project, you planned to cover up." The room went silent as the memo, time-stamped and signed with Julie's digital ID, proved she had intentionally falsified the safety risks to justify the demolition. Ellie stepped forward beside him, her presence quiet but formidable. "I've spent my life building this cafe, nurturing this neighborhood, and supporting my neighbors. The grind is not just a business, it's a home for our community. It cannot be replaced with parking lots or profit margins." Mark glanced at her, a brief, acknowledging nod. Together, they formed a united front. He, armed with facts and strategy. She, armed with passion and personal truth. The room's energy shifted. Where once there had been doubt, there was now clarity and gravity. Julie rose smoothly, her voice calm but strained beneath the pressure. "These accusations are exaggerated. Misinterpretations of routine business practices. Nothing here justifies halting a project designed to modernize and improve the city." Mark turned to the assembled officials. "I will let the documents speak for themselves." He methodically presented the proof, showing the discrepancies, the falsified records, and the clear attempts to bypass ethical standards. Every claim was traceable, every irregularity undeniable. As the room absorbed the evidence, murmurs turned into whispers of disbelief. Julie's confident facade began to falter. Her fingers clenched, her jaw tight. The officials exchanged glances, reviewing the materials with growing concern. Ellie's voice, soft but unwavering, filled the room. "We are not against progress. We are against erasure. The grind represents more than a cafe. It represents history, community, and the lives of countless people who call this neighborhood home." Mark added, "Preserving the grind does not hinder development. It integrates heritage with progress, ensuring the community remains intact while the city evolves. This evidence shows that the original plan threatened both integrity and fairness. Julie's composure cracked for a fraction of a second, a slip that did not go unnoticed. She realized the tide had turned. The officials, once deferential to her authority, now leaned toward preserving the community's interest. Minutes stretched into tension-filled hours. Questions were asked, clarifications made, and each time, Mark's evidence held firm. Ellie remained steadfast, occasionally interjecting with human stories, anecdotes, and appeals that no spreadsheet could quantify. Finally, the committee chair spoke. After reviewing the evidence presented, it is clear that the proposed demolition of the grind is not only unjustified but involves unethical manipulation. The project must be revised to preserve the café and incorporate community input. Any further attempts to override this decision will be met with legal and regulatory consequences. The room erupted in a controlled, yet palpable, sense of relief. Applause echoed faintly, tempered by the gravity of the official declaration. Mark exhaled deeply, shoulders sagging with exhaustion and relief. Ellie turned to him, eyes glistening with emotion, relief, gratitude, and a fragile spark of renewed trust. "We did it," she whispered, almost incredulously. Mark offered a small smile, his own exhaustion etched on his face. "We did. Together." Julie, silent and pale, gathered her belongings, her retreat dignified but unmistakable. She knew she had lost, her influence exposed, her reputation tainted, her plans foiled. She exited the room without a word, leaving the community and the grind intact. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer, the city's pulse less threatening. Mark and Ellie stepped onto the street together, the hum of life resuming around them, yet different now, charged with possibility, hope, and a sense of hard-won victory. The café, battered by corporate greed and personal betrayal, stood resilient. And for the first time in weeks, both Mark and Ellie allowed themselves a quiet moment of triumph, a recognition that their combined effort, integrity, and courage had preserved something worth more than profit: community, trust, and the fragile beginnings of something neither had dared to hope for. The city breathed around them, indifferent yet alive, but for Mark and Ellie, time seemed to slow as they stepped out of the conference room and into the street. The sun had reached a height that made the asphalt shimmer faintly, casting long, warm shadows. The grind stood behind them, unchanged, its doors swinging slightly in the morning breeze, a symbol of resilience. Ellie leaned against the doorway, hands tucked into her jacket pockets, scanning the street. Her lips curved into a subtle, exhausted smile. "It's still here," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "Despite everything, it's still here." Mark walked beside her, shoulder brushing lightly against hers. He allowed himself a rare, unguarded moment of relief. "It is," he said. "We saved it. Together." She glanced at him, eyes narrowing slightly with playful suspicion. "Not that I trust you completely yet." He chuckled, a low, tired sound. "Fair. That will take time." They stepped onto the café's small porch, the familiar scent of coffee mingling with fresh morning air. Ellie sat down first, easing into the wooden bench as if testing reality. Mark followed, settling beside her. Silence fell between them, comfortable, reflective. "You know," Ellie began, her voice quieter than usual, "everything feels different now. Not just the café. Us. The city. I thought I had to fight everything alone." Mark turned to her, eyes meeting hers. "You never were alone. Even when I made mistakes, even when Julie tried to turn everything against us. I was there. I just had to figure out how to show it without breaking you further." She nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind his words. The memory of betrayal was still raw, but now tempered by the knowledge that he had risked everything to protect the café, her, and the community. For a while, they simply sat there, watching passers-by, the faint sound of a street musician strumming a guitar, the distant hum of traffic. No one could see the battles that had raged behind closed doors, the manipulations, the threats, the near betrayals. Outside, life went on, but here, on this porch, time felt theirs to claim. Mark broke the silence. "We don't have jobs anymore. I'm out of the corporation. Julie won't be able to touch us directly, but there will be challenges." Ellie let out a soft laugh, tinged with irony. At least we're free. For the first time in forever, we're not under anyone else's control. That feels good. He smiled faintly. It does. And we have this, he said, gesturing toward the cafe. We have the chance to build something new, our way. Together. Ellie looked at him, the hesitation still in her eyes, the shadow of the past weeks lingering. Together, yes. But slowly. We can't rush it. Not again. Mark nodded. Agreed. Slowly. Carefully. Honestly this time. The morning sun spilled over them, casting long golden streaks across the porch. The warmth seeped into their shoulders, into their tired muscles, into the very air around them. The street was alive with movement, but for now, nothing else mattered. Ellie leaned back, letting the weight of relief and cautious hope settle. You know, she said softly, I don't know exactly what's next, but I do know this. The grind is safe, the community matters, and maybe there's a future for us too. One we choose ourselves. Mark reached out, lightly brushing her hand. We'll figure it out, he said. One day at a time. Together. And for the first time since Julie's manipulation, since the fear, the threats, and the near loss, they allowed themselves to imagine a life not dictated by contracts, power, or deceit, but by choice, trust, and shared effort. The cafe behind them hummed softly, the smell of fresh coffee and pastries mingling with the possibilities of a new day. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, but for Mark and Ellie, a chapter had ended, and a new one, uncertain, fragile, and entirely theirs, had begun. They sat side by side, silent but united, watching the neighborhood they had fought for, ready to face whatever came next, not as pawns, not as adversaries, but as partners, cautiously, deliberately, and fully alive.